Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Rewind, the Shenson Retrospective Film Series put on by the Toby Center for Jewish Studies at Stanford University. I'm Shana Hammerman. I'm the Associate Director of Jewish Studies. And with me today are Eitan Kensky, who is the Reinhardt Family Curator of Hebraica and Judaica at Stanford, and Paloma Eisenberg, who is, now I'm forgetting, a junior in the TAPS program, Theater and Performing Arts at Stanford. And she is herself a performer and is our student director of this film series. And we are delighted today to welcome Kenneth Turan, most famously the LA Times film critic for almost 30 years. He's written many books about film and is currently working on a book about Louis B. Mayer and Irving Thalberg, for the Yale University Press Jewish Live series, which is edited by our own Stephen Zipperstein at Stanford. So we can look forward to that and maybe hearing more from you when that book comes out. He also serves on the board of directors for the Yiddish Book Center, relevant perhaps to today's discussion and his interest in this particular film. So welcome, Kenneth. Thank you, Eitan, Paloma, and everyone else who's here. And I will turn it to you to offer your response on this film.
Okay. Yeah, this is an interrupt. I just want to get my screen a little bigger. If I can, maybe I can't, but let me see if I can mess with the view. Full screen, try that. Yeah, that's a little better. Okay, that's good. Yeah, I mean, this was an interesting film for me to look at. I've seen it before, but it'd been many years since I'd seen it. I remembered liking it, but I wasn't quite sure why I liked it. And the first thing that struck me, and the thing that I should say as kind of a preface, is that my parents were Yiddish-speaking immigrants. They came to the United States before the Holocaust, not after, but they shared, many things with the immigrant experience is kind of a constant. So, and the Yiddish that they spoke, and their Yiddish was their first language, so they spoke it all the time. They only spoke English when they wanted. It was a reverse. They spoke English when they wanted me to understand. Otherwise, they were largely Yiddish speaking. And the Yiddish that they spoke was very similar to the Yiddish you hear in this film. So it's kind of an emotional experience for me to watch this film. I think more so than might otherwise be the case with people who don't have that connection. I think the first thing I wanted to say about this film is that I felt, having watched it, it's kind of a miracle. I mean, it's a very moving film, but if you described it to someone who hadn't seen it, they would say, well, what's this film like? What do you see? It doesn't sound like it would be moving. It sounds like, well, why would I even want to watch that? But I think there's a lot of reasons to watch it. And I think, for one thing, the simplicity it's made with makes it very moving. It's very artfully done. It's very delicately done. It's really a very impressive little film. And I think in its day, because of the use of the Yiddish voiceover, it was kind of an anomaly. This is decades before Shtisel, decades before Unorthodox. You did not hear Yiddish on the screen. And now I've even seen several American independent films that are Yiddish language. So Yiddish is kind of, making a mini comeback. And so it was fun to see it from that sense, and it was unusual in that sense. And I think, if I were writing about it, I think maybe the first thing I would say is that it's kind of a memory piece twice over. It's a memory piece for the director and a memory piece for his mother, and I gather from what I've read about the film that it is his mother's actual tape recorded memories that we hear. It's not a Yiddish speaking actress, it's actually his mother. So it's his mother remembering and him kind of remembering his past through what his mother remembers. And it's also, it's an art film very much. It's a kind of an art film that used to be called an experimental film back in the day when people like Stan Brakhage were making films. They were called experimental films. And one of the things I read that I didn't know, but makes perfect sense now that once I've read it and seen the film, is that he was close to a more well-known filmmaker named Chantal Akerman, who was also Belgian, also had survivor parents, and the styles are similar in both films. If you've seen Chantal Akerman's films, she made many more films than this director. And you can see the similarity, and it's interesting to see that. And, I think also one of the key things I'd say about this film is that it's a melancholy film. It almost is telling you that the best, a bearable life is the best you can hope for. That's the message of this film. And I think my parents, as I said, were of a similar point of view. They were not really looking. Happiness in any kind of definition was not something they thought was in the cards. They just wanted to survive. And Yiddish is a good language for melancholy, I think. I think someone has written, it's not an original thought with me, that Yiddish is a language of lamentation. And you can feel that, in the mother's Yiddish voiceover. You can feel that lamentation, that sadness. And, you can feel, to me, that's the heart of the film, is this tape that the filmmaker made with his mother. You can feel the alienation in her voice, the exhaustion, the emotion, the fear. There are all kinds of lines that stood out for me. We cried more than we talked. She felt at the very end, she says, I was squeezed from all sides. I mean, life was something really just to be survived, given their experiences. We don't know what happened to them, how during the Holocaust. We meet them at the end of the war when they're leaving Lodz, going to Warsaw, then going to Brussels. We don't know what's happened to them, what kind of terrors they lived through. But we know by the time it ended, they were just happy to have survived. And survival was all they were looking for. They weren't looking, to be in an MGM musical, to dance down the yellow brick road. They were just looking to survive. And one of the other things I thought was interesting about the film is that it immerses us in its world very gradually. It starts just with static documentary shots. And one of the of train stations, of streets. And one of the interesting things about what it chooses to do, and it almost was a choice made out of necessity, these, if this had been a Hollywood film with an enormous budget, they would have recreated the streets of Brussels as they were when the filmmaker's parents arrived. But he can't do that. So he basically shoots the train stations and the streets of contemporary Brussels, which is probably like, 25 years past when his mother walked them initially. But it just is, it's effective. It doesn't sound like it would be effective. Of course, it's quite clear that it's contemporary Brussels. But somehow, because this voiceover is so powerful, and because those empty streets and empty train stations and lonely people waiting in train stations, because those shots are so evocative, it makes the whole thing seem timeless. And it's really, it doesn't hurt it. In fact, it somehow helps it that it's not back in the day. It's a photograph of today. And, first part of the film is all you see is these empty spaces and the voiceover. And gradually you are introduced to the actors who play his parents, who play other people in his parents' lives. And it's very, it's interesting that it waits a while to show us the two actors who play the parents. We don't get them immediately. It really wants to kind of gradually immerse us in this world, gradually immerse us in their life. First to see what they saw, to see the train stations, the streets, and then to finally bring them in as people. In a sense, the film kind of wants to warm us up. It's in no rush to get to whatever, it doesn't really have a story in terms of a drama, but there are incidents it does want to convey, things that did happen. And it takes a while to actually get to the point where it shows us incidents. It shows us small scenes. And it's interesting. It's an interesting choice he made, and I think a very effective one. It's also interesting that these scenes are also, they're not in Yiddish. The voiceover is in Yiddish, but the scenes are in French, which is one of the languages of Belgium, I believe. And I think partly he did it because those scenes were in French, likely when they played out, when the policeman comes and his father doesn't know what to say to him, when his mother goes to a bakery and can't get anyone to understand what she wants to do there. Those likely did play out in French, but also from a practical nature, finding Yiddish-speaking actors and actresses would have made an additional degree of difficulty to making the film. So I think that was a choice that worked out both ways. And that scene with the policeman, when the policeman comes in and all the father can say is because. The only word he knows how to say, whatever the policeman says, he just says because, and finally the policeman kind of gives up and disappears. But, I think, also the film, and I guess it's the way the tape was, the film, I think, the summation that the filmmaker's mother makes at the end, I think really put me away. It comes as a shock to hear that, these circumstances, these straight and difficult circumstances that she presents in the beginning of the film, I think maybe we think, as in many immigrant stories in the United States, things get better, they get more prosperous, they move away. No, this didn't happen with his parents. They worked 20 years in the same way. I think she says, I wrote some notes down, but I may have gotten them slightly wrong. My whole life was this workshop. I didn't know the world. I never saw the street. There's this enormous sadness, I think, in the way the film ends and in his mother's dialogue, not dialogue, monologue, where she talks about, how sad it was. It's not the usual immigrant story we hear. She's not happy she survived. It is what it was. And she says, this is the way our life was. This was it. And I think that's an immigrant story we don't hear that often. It's not the classic one, but I think it was very powerful, very moving. And I think the last, I wanted to, Eitan sent me some things that have been written about the film, and I just wanted to quote a couple of sentences from each of them, because I think they're nicely put about why the film is effective. One is from Amos Vogel, who used to write for the Village Voice, was an early exponent of, these kind of experimental independent films. He said, I'm trying to read my notes. He said, the film is a stylized tableau of lyric power with poetic representations of a past no longer available. I think that's a nice way to discuss it. And also Jay Hoberman, also for The Voice, called the film a complicated act of preservation, memory building, and exorcism. And I'm going to say that again, a complicated act of preservation, memory building, and exorcism. And I thought that was a very evocative way to talk about the film. This is, again, even though it's a very simple film, it's easy to describe what it does. There are no, special effects, no big set pieces, but it's exceptionally, I thought, very emotional, exceptionally moving. I was very, I want to say I was happy to see it again, and I was, but because it's such a kind of disturbing, melancholy film, I'm not sure how happy I was, but I was really grateful to have the chance to see it. It's an exceptional film. I think that's it for me for opening it up. I'm really looking forward to talking to it about with Eitan, because I think this is one of those films that really benefit from being talked about, because it's such a personal film and such an emotional film. So, okay, Eitan.
So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and thank you very much for being here. It's really an honor to talk about this movie. And in some ways, it kind of feels more like an artifact rescued from a period of time
yes.
that you only kind of occasionally have access to, as it doesn't have the most traditional or certainly most widespread distribution. So I'm curious. Do you remember when you first saw this movie? Did you see it in a theater? What was the reaction like? I got to watch the film last week with a small audience here at Stanford, and I think we kind of all left holding our breath and just kind of gasping and spellbound at the movie.
I think it's, for a lot of reasons, it's a much more emotional experience to see this film than you anticipate it's going to be. When you hear about it, when you watch it, I think I saw it, for some reason, I think I saw it at home. I think someone had given me I think it might have been a tape or something. I can't remember, but I don't remember seeing it in a theater, but I might have. It didn't, I think, get a theatrical release. I think maybe so. I'm not even, I looked in my notes. I don't think I'd ever actually written about it. I think I had heard about it and someone made it available to me, because I'm interested in film, I'm interested in Yiddish. I really felt I really needed to see this. And I think but I think I saw it on my own, both times I saw it. So it's interesting to hear you say that what the crowd reaction was when it ended. It's not a backslapping kind of movie.
No, it was more one of those reactions where you don't get up, everyone watches the credits, and then
Yeah.
we had a kind of makeshift screening room. So as I raised the screen, we were all kind of saying, okay, we got to talk to Kenneth Turan about this next thing. Everyone, don't, it's okay to breathe and
Yeah.
let go. So I thought maybe this would be an interesting moment of reflection and something that touches on what you talked about, which is that this is obviously a very personal story. But kind of making sense of what this film is and how to place it within any kind of genre frame, so that when you go to describe it to someone, you can give them a sense of what to experience. What genre does this belong to? Is this documentary? Is it narrative? Is it fact? Is it fiction? Does it fall somewhere kind of beyond fact and fiction? Does any of this really matter, for introducing someone to this film?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know, as you say, there's a lot of different things it does that you could talk about, you could mention. I mean, I think, again, to me, it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who is a film buff, who knows a lot about American film, if you say it's an experimental film, it has things in common with Chantal Akerman. I mean, someone who knows that, they would know immediately what you're talking about, and, it's a film that is partly, it's documentary in the sense that it's an actual reporting of his mother. This is not something he wrote for her to read. This is her own memories, her own reminiscences, her own things she thinks it's important to say. So it's got documentary elements, and the footage of the streets of Brussels and the train stations of Brussels, that's documentary footage. But this is as untraditional a documentary. It's so unlike a documentary that I'd be hard, if I called it a documentary, I think I'd mislead people. I think it's kind of, you have to acknowledge that this is a film that doesn't fit tidily into any category. Uses kind of documentary elements very much for documentary aims. It's trying to get emotions out. It's trying to describe kind of something that's very hard to describe. So I think it's hard. It's virtue, and what makes it hard to talk about is that you can't pigeonhole it. It doesn't remind you, except for Chantal Akerman, it doesn't remind you at all of anything else I'd seen. Certainly not other Yiddish language films, which are not like this.
I ask about documentary in part because I've seen it described with that word so many times, and yet it doesn't really feel right. I think your caution about that is correct, that if you described it as a documentary to someone, it would be misleading because it's not really what it's doing. And yet at the same time, it makes you wonder, as you're seeing things that could not be what it actually is purporting to be. It makes you wonder about at what moments the fact actually does kind of enter into it. So there are things such as when you're watching this house that they supposedly lived in, and they're going through the wallpaper, through the space, and it looks like it's decrepit, but then the camera eventually pulls back to reveal that you're watching a building that is torn apart. And you wonder, was this their actual home that's been now torn apart and by whatever kind of urban renewal has hit Brussels? Or is this a stand-in? Or then kind of most emphatically at the end, as you described it, kind of this gradually immersive process where you begin to wonder, oh, this could actually be the correct home and not just any kind of stand-in, because it is still the space where this mother is and where this mother feels trapped and disconnected from the outside world.
Yeah, no, it was interesting that way. I mean, it raises all those questions. I worried, absolutely. I was curious, is any of this stuff we're seeing, did they actually live in this apartment? Or is it something kind of like what they did with the train station, where they shot a modern train station because the feeling was the same? It's, I think one reason I wouldn't think of it as a documentary was that in some ways it's clearly not factual in some ways, like the train stations you see are not the train stations she's talking about. So right there, it departs from classic documentary. Everything it's doing is to get emotional effect. And I think it's going for a truth that it feels is more significant, deeper than the truth of the real image. And so it doesn't care that it's showing you, different train station, maybe even a different room. It's looking for a different kind of truth. And most classic documentaries, they don't say that. They don't say, we don't care what we're showing you. You know, they try and be scrupulous. They try and show you things that are exactly as they're purported to be. You know, recreating scenes, as so many of the scenes are done in this film, you know, the scene in the bakery, the scene in the kitchen where they have to share the kitchen with this woman who's clearly not happy to be sharing the room with them. I mean, these are recreations. And, you know, even though we've now seen more of them in documentaries, classically, they're not in documentaries. There's not so much recreation, you know. Almost nothing we see is actually, the documentary aspect is mostly the oral one. Almost nothing we see is what we're hearing. You know, we're seeing scenes of today, or scenes, you know, dramatic scenes. Everything is about the past, you know, a past that was not filmed, cannot, you know, so he has no access to it. I mean, it's a very, again, it's a very daring concept when you really start to think of it. It's amazing that it works. You know, again, if I was listening to this program, not having seen the film, I would say, well, this can't be any good. You know, sounds like a mishmash, but it's the magic of cinema. It's not a mishmash. You come out very moved.
So maybe let's talk about some of those mishmash elements, you know, a bit more and really focus in on them, which is to say these, I like the term you used while you were giving your initial thoughts, incidents, you know, that take place, that we watch these incidents in these people's lives. And I'm wondering if we could just unpack a little bit more how they interact with the voiceover, and maybe also if these incidents are in fact part of trying to tell a kind of story with a discrete narrative arc. And even whether or not thinking about question of a narrative and how that might interact with the kind of timeless quality of what the movie is giving us.
Well, the incidents are very interesting because they are not, I mean, again, we don't know clearly at some point, I'm assuming that the mother told the son these incidents, and that's why he remembers them. That's why he's dramatized them. But we never hear her. We hear her talking about, I forget what they're called, these little things that she's made, these little dough type things that she wants. Farfalle.
Which I only know from Passover, and Passover farfalle looks completely different.
Yeah, yeah. So she makes these things and she tells us that she's making them. But the thing that we see, which is her going into a bakery and she wants to use the bakery's oven, and it's a very hard time for her to be understood. And, you know, one of the things I think as I'm thinking about that scene, one of the things that's fascinating about it, you know, in the classic story, the Belgians who don't understand her, you know, she's clearly a foreigner who lives in their country. They're not necessarily happy to see her, but they try and help her. You know, it's not the classic kind of, oh, we hate you, go back to where you came from. That didn't happen. I mean, she didn't get what she wanted. She didn't get to use the oven. But I thought it was interesting that everyone in those scenes, there's a guy in the back who doesn't look very happy, but both the baker and the woman who's trying to help, they are trying to be helpful. They're not saying, how come you can't speak French? You know, what are you doing here? You know, the classic kind of immigrant horror story. That didn't happen, but even without that happening, it was a crushing moment for her. You know, she was so upset. I mean, she had spent all this time and money and resources were scarce making this farfalle, and she throws them in the river. She's so fed up. It really underscores the kind of frustration of this situation of the immigrants, even if people are not necessarily treating you badly. You know, people are not being horrifying to her, you know, but they're just, she's at a loss. Being an immigrant means being at a loss, you know, be eternally behind the 8 ball. You never come out, you know.
I think one of the things that's so fascinating about that scene in the bakery, as opposed to being this, you know, the scene with the police officer, and they're both very jarring in their own way, but with the scene in the bakery, there's a moment of breakage from this dichotomy of the voiceover is in Yiddish, and then the narrative that you're seeing is in French, which is that one of the people who's trying to help her switches into German. And she switches into, she says, you know, nicht möglich. And this is not impossible, not possible. And this is something that any Yiddish speaker would be able to understand, because it is so close to the Yiddish equivalent of nicht möglich, you know, at this moment. And you could imagine that there could be a kind of partial exchange of being able to speak back, of, you know, perhaps even a knowledge of German on some base level, given the realities of what these people have been through. But the film doesn't want to do this. The film kind of leaves you with this breakage and this moment of breakage rather than taking you into a kind of cross-cultural dialogue.
Yeah. Well, one of the things, just as you say that crossed my mind is that it's possible that even though the woman said this, trying to be helpful, I mean, we don't know what happened to these people during the Holocaust. I mean, it's possible that even though the German was used in in a genuine attempt to be helpful, it just triggered some kind of awful memory of awful stuff that had happened to her. And instead of making her feel, aha, there's someone here who can, maybe can help me out. Maybe I can speak Yiddish to her and she'll understand what I'm saying. Instead, it could have horrified her. It could have been part of the reason why she threw everything into the river, that she just said, the world is just too hard. Things are just too hard.
I have this question for later, but I think maybe I'll ask you right now, which is one of the theme for our series, for this year has been kind of the house and the home in the space of Jewish film. And this is very much a movie about people finding different apartments, in a literal level, a movie about finding different apartments until ultimately you find the place where you can actually be settled for a period of time. And then, of course, the crushing reveal of this film that it's actually kind of a prison, that is entrapping of her in this space. But I'm thinking about this kitchen scene and then its kind of culmination in throwing the river. Do you find this to be an extremely Jewish moment? Do you think it has echoes throughout the rest of the film? Is it kind of a one-off? Or do we have this moment of the kitchen is this space of cultural transmission, and now that is no longer possible?
Yeah, I mean, it does both, I think. I mean, I think in one sense it's about, she's trying to, she knows this is the best home she's going to get. She's not going to be leaving Belgium. This is it. So she's trying to make it more like the home she lost. But it turns out not to be possible. It turns out very starkly not to be possible. That the woman doesn't, the baker doesn't say, come back later or come back tomorrow or I'm busy today. She just says, no, you can't do it. I can't do it. And I think that maybe that crystallizes for her the impossibility of having a home that would feel meaningfully like a home for her, that it's just not going to happen, which she kind of half fears in the first place, given the circumstances of her life. But this is kind of like hitting the nail on the head, saying, you thought maybe you could get some home into your life, you could get some echo of your life before the Holocaust? No, it's like a door slammed in her face. And maybe that's why it seems like an excessive reaction to throw it in the river, as opposed to say, well, maybe I'll try another bakery, I'll try another day, or maybe there's something I can do with it at home. No, it's just such a slap in her face. Again, even though people are not being overtly hostile towards her, in a certain way, they want to be helpful. Even the baker doesn't, she just says, I can't do it. I mean, she could have gone to extraordinary lengths, but most people probably would do what she had done. But I think this is so upsetting that she just throws it in the river. That's how upset she is.
So one thing that really struck me while watching the film this time is really actually how little any of this is Samy Szlingerbaum's story. That he's creating this kind of aesthetic atmosphere and he's creating the condition for telling different memories. But the story really doesn't in any sense belong to him. But Brussels Transit is often described as the family's narrative. But watching it this time, I was really confronted with the obvious, which is that this is the mother's story, and very emphatically the mother's story. So I think, please.
Go ahead.
No. I mean, in a standard academic style, I write very long statements that eventually become a question, but please jump in right now.
Yeah, I mean, it's true. You don't see, you see the father, but you never hear from him. You don't know what he's thinking, except he's clearly worried about supporting the family. But clearly, the existence of this film, demonstrates how much his mother's story and living this life with his parents when he was very young, living this fearful, impoverished, refugee life really formed him. I mean, he made this film because he could not make this film. Maybe he would have, I understand he died quite young. Was he 35? I mean, maybe he would have made other films, but he had to tell this story. This story obsessed him. This story created him. He is the child of that experience. And I think it's an attempt to understand himself, to kind of come to terms with himself, is one of the things that I would guess drove him to make this film, because even though it's not technically his story, he's very little, and it's not clear that he even remembers that much of it, but he could sense the sadness, I'm sure, in his parents, the frustration in his parents, the nervousness in his parents. One of the things I know from my own, my own immigrant parents, and my mother was fairly young when she came here. She was about 5 or 6, but my father was in his 20s, and he was really a full-on immigrant, and he never felt at ease. He didn't have as many problems as the people in the film, but as an immigrant, you just don't. Some do, but a lot of immigrants, you just never feel at ease. This is a new place. This is a place where you're not sure if you fit in. You're not sure of the mores. You're not sure how people do things. It's a very disturbing experience to be an immigrant. And, I think he was a child. Samy was a child of that experience, and he was trying to make sense of it. He was trying to say, well, what actually happened? I think that's why he probably encouraged I think his mother said, Samy, get a tape recorder. I have something to say. I don't think it happened that way. I think Samy had to,
So in fact, the movie gives us actually the exact opposite thing happen, which is that there's a moment during the first voiceover where we hear her pulling away.
Exactly.
She says that she doesn't want to, she can't go on anymore right now.
Anymore. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I guess my question is, and I think you made a really interesting point about why this is Samy's story, and in what sense it's Samy's story, and this kind of this childhood need to explore and explain. But if we think about it in terms of ethics and the mother's desire to kind of not want to tell her story at different times, does Samy have this right to question and present his mother's voice this way? And as a critic, how do you respond to these moments where she's saying, no, in this movie that we are watching?
My feeling when I hear that is that that's how she felt at the moment. At the moment, she just had enough. At the moment, it was too painful. I mean, I feel that finally she wanted her story told. You feel that especially at the end when she gives that really, geschrei, that cry from the heart, where she just is, she basically says, no one knows how hard my life has been. No one knows. And she wants people to know. I think, my own father really refused to talk about his experiences, the things he'd been through in Europe. He just didn't want to talk about his life in Europe at all. And he just never did it, So I think the fact that she did it made me feel that overall she wanted to say it, even though it was different. What you hear is not necessarily that she does, to me, what you hear is not necessarily that she doesn't want anyone to know or she doesn't want to say it. What you hear is that it's difficult. It's hard for me to tell this story. But I think if she really didn't want to tell it, didn't want the world to know it, she wouldn't have said it. I didn't get the feeling that he bludgeoned it out of her. It was hard for her, but it was important for him to hear it. And, mothers are always wanting to make their children happy. So she wanted to do it for his sake. But I think for her own sake, I think she lived such a frustrating life, such a closed-in life, that kind of cry that you hear at the end from her about how limited her life has been. I mean, that's heartbreaking. And I think she wanted people to know that. She just wanted people to know, really in some ways, how she'd suffered.
I think that's right. And I mean, I do think that this is a movie that does want to question who gets to tell stories and what the normal frame of watching this might be. Just, for example, this is not the story of the father's steady pursuit into business and kind of the toehold that they got into the Belgian experience. I mean, it is not that story, but that's not at all the perspective and the frame and how we view things. So we know Akerman was a collaborator and friend of Samy Szlingerbaum, and certainly we're watching something that resembles, news from home for a lot of this time, or you can misunderstand it in terms of news from home. But the ending of the movie, as you mentioned, really kind of takes it to a darker place, and it's almost as if we're watching Jean Dielman and kind of having to unpack, how this space has, confined and constrained her, and determined so much of her life. So is this is it wrong to call this a feminist film? Is that a correct statement? Do you think Szlingerbaum was trying to intentionally bring out his mother's voice in terms of this marginalization? Does it make sense would you reach that only if you know Akerman's contemporary films?
Again, there's a lot of different ways you can characterize this film. I mean, because one of the things it does is underline, the struggles and the heartbreak of this woman who happens to be the filmmaker's mother. But, if I would almost try and widen that, to me, it almost feels like a humanist film. It's about the struggles of people, it's about struggles because she's a mother and she's in charge of the home and she's in charge of the children. And plus she has to work. It does have that feminist aspect to it, but I think it's I almost think it's a wider canvas than that. I would call, I think it's in, for me, if I would characterize it, I would call it an immigrant film. This is a side of the immigrant story we do not always see, where they survived, but that's it. They didn't survive and prosper. They didn't survive and go on to great things. They just survived. And that's an immigrant story we don't hear a lot. We like to think that, we hear so many different sides of the immigrant story, from people's hostility to immigrants to immigrant success stories. This is a side of that we don't hear that much because it's very melancholy. We don't want to hear it as a culture. We don't want to hear that some people just survive. They barely get by. Yes, they didn't starve to death. Yes, they didn't become homeless, but just barely. And bare survival is not a story that is always on top of what people want to deal with.
So picking up on what you just said, it's interesting to me that you use the term immigrant film, because I think that is right in a certain sense. And maybe this is looking for a distinction that doesn't exist, but so much of this movie feels like a refugee film as opposed to an immigrant film.
Well, absolutely. No, frankly, I think refugee is a better word for it. Immigrant, I don't know why I chose that word, but I think refugee is more like it because, they were fleeing. They were definitely refugees. It wasn't like they decided, they were basically, we don't know what their situation is. We don't know anything about their situation. We don't know how they got the money for the train tickets. We don't know anything about them, what they survived in the war. But clearly they're fleeing. They're without a doubt, fleeing in a major way from, what had been clearly near-death experiences for them during the war, and from a city the early and I've seen films of it, so I was especially struck by it. Her talking of how destroyed Warsaw was, when they were there. It's astonishing when you look at documentary footage. Like Warsaw was almost, to an extent that is almost unimaginable. Warsaw was almost leveled, and so they were refugees from this horror story. And yes, they got out, and yes, they didn't die, and they made a place for themselves, and they had children who, to a certain extent, prospered. But this does not feel like, refugees make good. This is not that story.
And if anything, it's it felt very shockingly political. Once, this movie surrounds you with layers of kind of aesthetic and makes you think that you're in this experimental film, that it's capturing memory, that there's this very complicated interplay between what you are seeing and what you are hearing. And yet at the same time, it does have these scenes where you kind of recognize that these are refugees, that they are constant pressure of being of the authorities coming. And it's played in a kind of innocent way here, but that's only because, there's the police officer doesn't seem to press it, that they're pulling up against the state, that their whole, the work is a fiction. They have to sneak around in order to do piecemeal labor, that only by the most tangential way can they kind of get a toehold into this space. So is it a political film? And if so, does it try to really, how does it make this political story relevant?
Well, it definitely, again, I'm resistant in general to labeling things because I think you run the risk of excluding potential people who want to watch it. You say, I don't want to see, it's too political. It is. Again, I react to all that in terms of emotion, in terms of fear. What I really got out of that scene and those scenes in general, when they talk about changing apartments and how to do that, and you see them leaving in the middle of the night in one place, their life is one of constant fear. It's a backdrop to everything they do because they clearly, I don't know if they ever got them, they don't have papers. I forget which relative it is, an uncle or somebody kind of blusters them into the country. You know, they arrive and they don't have papers, and the Belgian authorities are going to send them back. And the uncle arrives and he opens his briefcase and he takes out all kinds of things. And they finally get, what you hear is they finally get a tourist visa. I mean, clearly the guy at the train station, he didn't know what to do, but he didn't want to let them in legally, but he didn't want to, he didn't want to send them out. So he gives them a, they're clearly not tourists. They're not there to see the sights, but they exist there for years on this tourist visa by just hiding and being fearful of the knock on the door. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of films that deal with the Nazi period, the knock on the door, we've seen in a million films, it's the Nazis coming to get you. That's what the knock on the door classically means. But here, it's interesting how that's similar but different. Yes, it's the authorities. Yes, it's people who could change your lives if, they decide to. But the guy turns out to be not very menacing at all, but the fear is real. The fear and the danger is real. I mean, so I kind of reacted to it that way. Just again, another notion of how difficult their lives were, as if it wasn't hard enough to have to earn a living, as if the cultural dislocation wasn't hard enough. They had the very real fear that, if they were, if someone discovered that they didn't have papers, they would really have a difficult time. I don't know if they'd be put in prison, if they'd be shipped out of the country. They didn't know either. All they knew was, we better not get discovered. So that fear, in addition to everything else, was kind of the canopy over their lives.
So I'll ask one or two more questions, and then we want to open it up to the audience. I see we already have one in the Q&A, but if people have questions, please leave them in. And also Shana and Paloma will rejoin for the broader Q&A. But to get back to, I think an obvious question that we haven't fully unpacked, why Yiddish? There's a lovely line and interpretation in the J. Hoberman review that you pointed out earlier, which is, he wrote that the film literalizes the Yiddish term for Yiddish, Mama Loshen, mother tongue, by having this be the kind of mother's story. But I think we can also see it as this movie is returning speech to her, that she had this language that was wrested away, and that she won't even connect in the kind of broken German Yiddish conversation, that she has to learn French, which we do hear her speak as part of the voiceover. So it seems it becomes natural. So I'm wondering though, as you say, it was an anomaly in 1980, 1981. The only other Yiddish movie of any kind of prominence in that time period is Hester Street, which is a very, very different story. And there we kind of have an Americanization story, and Yiddish as being used as part of that. So I'm wondering if there's any, beyond the kind of the maternal dimension, what the Yiddish is doing here and why you felt it was so important for it to be included back in this, in this film. Is it a question of authenticity, nostalgia? Does it add to our sense of dislocation?
Yeah, well, I think, without that, I basically feel well, it's the most obvious thing to say. Without that Yiddish, there's no film. Without, there's literally no film, If an actress was reading it, or if, it was just visuals without any voice, it would not be worth seeing 40 years later. I think the Yiddish and the heartfelt quality, his mother felt at home in Yiddish. So in that sense, it was Mama Loshen. This was a language that she really felt at home in. This was a language she could pour her heart out in. And I think that was really, that's more so. I mean, almost feel like I'm tearing up talking about it, because her pain, the reality of her story could not come through in any other way except through the use of Yiddish, So I think it's, even though, I don't know, it's interesting if you add up the minutes, probably Yiddish is heard on screen for, I don't know what percentage of the film, not an overwhelming percentage, but it's the heart of the film. Without it, the film would be too lacking. It just wouldn't be as effective.
I think when I first encountered this film through a lecture that Eric Goldman gave at YIVO, right at the moment when kind of new Yiddish film was starting to pick up speed. And I'm going to date this to around 2009, 2010, because I know that the cast of Romeo and Juliet in Yiddish was in the audience.
Oh, yeah.
Which is another interesting movie that has Yiddish in the title and has Yiddish scenes, but is often really about the politics of Yiddish, more perhaps than using Yiddish itself. But I bring this up because I think we want to engage with the counterfactual of, would Samy Szlingerbaum, a Yiddish filmmaker, would he want to create more Yiddish films when it doesn't really seem like we could actually have that conversation?
It's an interesting question. It's a real what if question, if he had lived and if he had, one assumes he's such a talented filmmaker, one assumes that he would have made other films. If I were to guess, I would say no. I would say this would be a one-off for him, that he would not, not that he'd be hostile to it or resistant to it, but I don't know that there's another story involving Yiddish that he would want to make, so yeah, it's an interesting question. What would he have done? Would Yiddish have played a part in his cinema ongoing? I don't know. It's a very fascinating, it's not as easy a question. It seems like a very simple, straightforward question, but the answer is anything but. It's really not clear where he would have gone and how much Yiddish, how much of a part Yiddish would have played in his future films. It's just not clear.
So we have a note in the chat from a scholar of Yiddish film, Yves Sikulert, that there was a plan to connect it to, that he was planning to do another Yiddish connected feature, whatever that might have been.
Glad to hear that.
We have two about his own adolescence as a gay son growing up in a Yiddish speaking household, but going to Belgian school, which sounds like it would have been a truly fascinating film. But we do have two questions related, one about music and the question of music and song in this film. So can you unpack how you think the music and song is functioning and what role it's playing?
Well, the first thing you hear, the first Yiddish is, if I remember correctly, the first Yiddish you hear is her singing. She's singing these songs. And, I think that, we don't know what order what was when he recorded this. We don't know if it started with her singing. I tend to think it probably didn't. But I think he understood that again, the film is all about slowly immersing us in this world, very slowly. And it's easier to get involved in a different language, in a different culture, in a different world through song, through music. It's got a nice melody. It's very, it's very sad. Certainly when you hear this, even if you don't read you can tell from the tone of the singing that it's not a happy song, So the song helps us understand that we're going to hear a sad story, but it also slowly immerses us in this world, in this language, And I think it's not, I don't think it starts with the song because that's the first thing that's on the tape. I think it happened at a certain point in the interview, and he had the great idea to start with it, to kind of both put us in the mood and to immerse us in the language, immerse us in the world, immerse us in the feeling tone of the film. You almost know all you need to know about this film from hearing her sing that song. It prefigures everything. It even prefigures the sadness at the end, So I thought that was a very intriguing way to begin and very effective.
So before we open this up to the audience, we talked about the fact that you watched the older version of this film on DVD rather than seeing the newly restored version. And I do think that the politics of restoration is actually very interesting, because it's curious to me that we have this movie about refugees being restored just at this moment of, another European refugee crisis. And maybe so you can see film restoration, hopefully you can read between the lines, as a kind of, political and curative act. But I guess I'd like you to know about the aesthetics of watching the older version and how you feel like that might have played into this.
Well, it was interesting. We exchanged emails about which version I was going to watch, and I am just streaming sometimes doesn't work. I get this sign that says your internet connection is unstable. Even though I live in Los Angeles, I live in a part of the city where I might as well be in rural Montana for the way my internet works. But so I like a DVD. I knew the DVD would be of lesser visual quality, that this new print existed. but I made the choice because I wanted to be sure to be able to watch it. And, you know, it had pros and cons. You know, on the one hand, I was very curious once I saw, you know, that the DVD is, as advertised, is not of remarkably good quality. I mean, part of me wanted to see it the way he had seen it, the way Samy had seen it, the way the filmmaker had seen it. I wanted to see this, what colors, what the kind of, you know, what kind of black and white it was in his original conception, you know, how that looked, and that would have been sharper and tighter, and it would have been interesting. But in some way, I started to feel by the end that the kind of very grainy nature of the DVD version I watched kind of enhanced the sadness, enhanced the melancholy, you know, that it was just kind of, it somehow fit that this was kind of, it's like, this is all about worlds falling apart, worlds not holding, centers not holding, you know, and to have the film kind of be kind of floating away and disappearing into granularity, that almost felt like it was fitting to be that way, that it added to the emotional heft of the film to see it, you know, in not a very good print. But that being said, I'm now dying to see it in a better print. You know, it's not like, no, I don't want to, you know, I'm dying to see what Samy wanted. I mean, that's the purpose of restoration, is you get to see the film the filmmaker made. You know, you're honoring the filmmaker, you're honoring his choices. You're saying this deserves to be seen as he wanted you to see it.
And just to mention The Godfather again briefly, the colors have changed dramatically as that film has kind of been restored and gone through that process. And, you know, the kind of darker version of the film has disappeared, and we're seeing a much kind of clearer, colorful version of that movie.
Yeah, it's interesting. You know, I was just told you I've just been thinking about The Godfather, talking about The Godfather. And, you know, it reminded me that Gordon Willis, the cinematographer, his nickname was the Prince of Darkness, because he loved dark, murky cinematography. That's kind of what he lived for. You know, he didn't want to have a light, bright version of the film. So I'd be curious to know, you know, what he would have thought of the new, brighter versions.
Yep. I think that actually, to get back to a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, the thing that the restoration truly blew me away with wasn't the visual quality, which is markedly improved, but the sound quality. And it's so much more sonorous now, and there's so much more resonance to kind of everything that's being said, especially in, and it really brings out the contrast of the kind of stark, empty spaces and this beautiful voice who's either talking or singing and narrating in this incredibly engaging way.
That's very interesting. I hadn't even thought of that, but no, that makes me even more anxious to see the new version, because there is a flatness to the sound in the version I saw, and it's great to hear that it's not the way it's supposed to be.
So we have time for another question or two, and while people are either placing them in the chat, or Shana or Paloma are willing to unmute their video, maybe I should also just ask this question of, you know, when did you become really curious in Yiddish film? And do you think that any of the new, if you had to pick one film from kind of each era of Yiddish film,
oh gosh,
for people to experience, what would that be?
Oh gosh, there's so many. You know, it was all. I feel this about Yiddish culture in general, and definitely about Yiddish film. It was a whole world. You know, it was its own self. It contained all kinds of films. You know, I can name two or three off the top of my head that I'm just big fans of. I mean, to me, if I had to pick one that I thought was the one that would last more, that had a secure place in film history, I would pick, obviously, the Dybbuk. I think it's, you know, I don't know how much pushback I get from other Yiddish film fans, but clearly the Dybbuk is an extraordinary film and it's not just an extraordinary Yiddish language film. I think it's an extraordinary film, period. I've watched it numerous times. It never fails to engage me, even though by this time I know exactly what's going to happen and I know all the beats, you know, and everything, but I still think it's an exceptional film. I think Tevye, I've been talking about Fiddler on the Roof with some filmmakers recently, and I think Tevye, the Maurice Schwartz Tevye, is just, you know, he's such a great character. I mean, you could go with Uncle Moses, but I prefer Tevye because it's such an interesting contrast to Fiddler on the Roof, so I would pick Tevye as well. And, you know, there's a kind of a sad romantic film that I'm very fond of called The Light Ahead. I think it's a later Yiddish film, and I think Jim Hoberman called them, you know, the most beautiful couple in the history of Yiddish film, you know, the two people who play the lovers in The Light Ahead. And that's it's a very moving film. It's a different kind of a Yiddish film because it kind of has romance elements that are very vivid. So I think those three films give you a kind of a range of Yiddish film, and those are the three I'd go with. I may be forgetting something obvious, but off the top of my head, those are the three I'd go with.
Any newer Yiddish films you'd want to include, or really it's all just prestige TV and streaming shows?
I mean, for me, Shtisel is just, I mean, I'm not alone in saying this. I think Shtisel is remarkable, for a lot of different reasons. And it's great to hear the Yiddish, although it's interesting, I don't know what the phrase is, a gelernte Yiddish. It's a Yiddish that's learned. What's great about the Yiddish in Brussels Transit is that that's a native speaker, And again, that's the Yiddish I grew up with, and it's different. It's different. I almost think it has more emotional resonance when Yiddish spoken by. I mean, we're running out of native speakers, but that's just the way it is. I'm happy that there's so much interest in it now, but I'm so glad that so many native speakers have been recorded that we can hear what Yiddish sounded like. But Shtisel, I think, is a remarkable program. Most of it is in Hebrew. It's the old people who speak Yiddish. But whenever it switches off from Hebrew to Yiddish, like I sit up in my chair, I say, great. I'm always happy to hear the Yiddish.
Thank you, Kenny and Eitan. I have a question, a little less turning away from this joyful conversation of the sound of Yiddish. So the big elephant on the screen is the lack of the actual Holocaust in this story about Holocaust refugees. We don't know what happened to them, like you said. And I'm wondering what you think about that. It's hard for me as somebody who came of age in the age of the Spielberg Shoah Foundation and the recording of testimony being this urgent project for a generation, that we don't hear her testimony and we don't hear her story. And you said maybe it's like you talked about your own father not wanting to talk about his life in Europe. If you think that this is what it's about, or if you think that Szlingerbaum, I'm saying that correctly, made this choice to say this is a story about when they arrive. This is a story about their lives as refugees in Brussels and not a story about what happened before. Yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts on that.
I think the second, it feels to me what happened. He wanted to tell his mother's story, the story he wanted to tell was almost a story that he'd been a part of. He wanted, the story that he'd grown up with. He wanted to explore that. I think it felt to him like what had happened to them during the war was a separate story, that it wasn't one big story, that it wasn't a piece of their story. That was another story. I mean, just like Yves Siegler said, his new film would have been about yet another story, his experience. Maybe he could have done a trilogy. Maybe at a certain point he would have figured out a way to talk about their Holocaust experience. But it felt to me that it felt to him that was a separate story, and I was convinced by that. I noticed the lack of specifics, but I didn't miss them. I think that this story is rich enough and deep enough, and his mother's voice and memories are strong enough that I didn't miss it. I mean, I wouldn't have troubled me if it was in there. But it's the filmmaker's decision. I respect it, and I think it was the right one for him, for sure.
Right, and I think, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, the melancholy. This is clearly coming from a place of trauma, and then trauma sort of continuing, and I think that's felt too. And there's no real consensus on when the Holocaust begins and when the Holocaust ends, and so we can see the tentacles of this trauma, right, going into these younger generations and all the way through a film in 1980. So that's pretty remarkable.
And on that note, the one thing that I would add is to highlight something you said earlier, is that the war story is the part that he's most not present for. It's the part that is where Samy is the most absent, that the initial relocation contained his older brother, who was 3. So he must have been born really at the tail end of the war in Europe. But Samy is just not a part of it. And so to figure out how he fits into this narrative, it really does begin with the kind of relocation to Belgium.
Yeah, definitely. And, we know, I mean, it's interesting, and I'm sure this is what the filmmaker felt. If you're interested enough in this film to watch it, you know what happened. You know what they came from. You know, you didn't say, gee, why are they leaving? I wonder, you know exactly more or less what happened to them. You don't need it. Don't need it. You know, it would have been interesting, but he understood that dramatically it was on anyone seeing this film would know exactly, you know, in general terms, what these people had been through, what they were leaving behind. No one would be saying, why are they leaving? You know, we all know why they're leaving.
And it's also such a, you know, by this point, the notion of the train as this kind of visual metaphor for the Holocaust is so well established and so known that simply, you know, recounting the journey in reverse and how this family had to travel from Lodz is taking you there without actually taking you there. And by having it be mostly in the stations as opposed to in the journey, it kind of visually emphasizes another point.
Yeah, that's a great point. I hadn't even thought about that, you know, so much of the Holocaust is people conveyed to the camps by trains. That's how they were, you know, they weren't taken there in trucks by and large, taken there in trains. So starting with an extended train sequences and train metaphors really reminds you of that, you know, this is, you know, they were using trains. In theory, trains were saving them, but they were only saving them so much.
Eve in our Q&A asks a really great question, and I was also thinking of this, she's thinking about Samy questioning Malka to Art Spiegelman interviewing Vladek in Mouse. And Mouse also is sort of, we get the story of what happened during the war, but we really, it's really a lot about the aftermath. And do you find that those relationships are similar?
You know, it's been too long since I've read Mouse. I don't remember the specifics. It sounds similar. But I can't speak, you know, maybe Eitan, maybe you can have a better sense than I do. It's just been too long since I've read it.
I'll give the same answer, but I would encourage people to try and buy it, although I hear it's sold out everywhere right now. So please still have a copy.
I mean, I think it's interesting that we're trying to find a way to talk about this film comparatively, and we can compare it to Akerman's films, or we can compare it to these sort of other refugee post-Holocaust tales. And here we have this child to parent interview, you know, decades later. And so we're sort of fitting this DVD onto the shelf of related films and literature. And I think that leads us to Paloma's question.
Hi, thank you so much. This is really powerful. I'm just like taking it all in. But I just wanted to ask you why you think that film was like the best medium to tell this specific story. And I know we just talked about like the trains and like that, the visual representation of the Holocaust and where they came from. But yeah, I'm wondering that.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, it's the medium he chose, you know. I mean, I don't even, you know, but you know, I mean, it's a way to amplify. It's a very elegant, discreet, artistic way to amplify what's on the tape recording. I think just the tape recording would not, you know, would be moving, but wouldn't be as moving as the film is. To turn it into something like Mouse, which I guess would have been possible. He could have turned it into, you know, a narrative, but I think that would have been, again, moving in a different way. He was a filmmaker, and this was what he felt. This was his way of telling the story. I don't know that it's the best way, but it's inevitably the way he's going to tell it. You know, maybe someone who was a, you know, if he had been a composer, and literally, I mean, I'm not being facetious, he maybe could have written an oratorio, you know, maybe there are other mediums that could have dealt with this in an emotional way. But I think he chose this film medium because that's what he wanted to, you know, it's not like he wanted to make a film in addition to everything else he wanted to do. And this was how he chose to convey that story. And I think it's a very good one. Would an oratorio have been better? I don't know, you know, but I think we can agree that this one is exceptionally good. You know, he made remarkable use of, you know, that recording.
So I just want to thank you once again for being here with us today. I think we're basically have exhausted all of your time.
I could keep talking, you know, I mean, this is a fact. And again, once I finished watching the film, I watched it again just a couple of nights ago. I mean, the first thing I said to myself is that this is going to be a great film to talk about. There is so much in this film. Again, even though it's a very simple film on some level, you know, you can describe what it does quite simply, but where it's coming from, the emotional import, what everything means, there's a lot to talk about with this film, you know, and I'm so glad that I said to myself, I'm so happy to be, you know, I wasn't so happy with having to give the 10-minute introduction that I said, what am I going to say? But talking to you about it, I was really looking forward to getting questions from people. I was really looking forward to. This is really a film that has a communal impact, and it's great to talk about in a group. It really is.
No, I agree completely. And, you know, it's been great as people are, you know, we started the series, theaters were closed, everyone was at home. We're looking for a way to connect and create another community about film, especially for those of us who care about it so much and can thrive in the presence of the audience. You know, as people are kind of stepping back into the theater, it's fascinating, and you know what role we can continue to play. You know, we showed the movie last week, and I mentioned it was a small audience. There were only about 5 of us, but there were only 5 people in the audience when I saw Drive My Car, which I think is the, you know, the best movie of 2021. So I think in that regard, you know, Samy Szlingerbaum's film has a kind of endlessly timeless quality and is equally as appealing.
And it's interesting that the very fact that it's out of time, that the voiceover is talking about one period of time and what you're seeing is a totally other period of time, in some odd way, that makes it timeless. At this point in time, that makes it timeless, because we're not watching documentaries of, you know, Brussels in the late 1940s. We're watching totally different decades. And somehow by now, that works beautifully together,
And I really do love the suggestion that just came up in the Q&A of comparing this to Mouse. It's something that, you know, obviously it's on a lot of people's minds, and it's been in my mind as an abstract concept, but now I have a real reason to come back to it right away.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great comparison, even though I can't remember the specifics. Obviously, I read it. Now I want to go back upstairs. I know where it is on my shelf. I'm going to take it down and read it again. You know, it's a great comparison to this. Really, really great.
So once again, I want to thank you, Kenneth Turan, for being here with us today. I hope that you'll come back sometime. Our next event is in a couple of weeks. It's a very different world. It's Down and Out in Beverly Hills, and we'll be, again, the theme for this year is House and Home in Jewish film. So Down and Out in Beverly Hills. And we'll be discussing the movie with Melissa Broder and Rachel Schuckert. And we'll also be talking about the Elliot Gould film Move, which is a little bit harder to get your hands on, but is similarly about people needing to move apartments. So thank you very much for being here with us today. Thank you to His Majesty, the King of Belgium, for letting us see this film.
A great guy.
Thank you all.